What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about David is a fugitive. He's on the run from Saul. We're going to see his desperation. How can God's anointed have desperation? And we're also going to see God's deliverance of David. This is a long road that David is going to have to endure. We're going to see that in chapter 21 to 22, verses 5. Without further ado, let's get right into this video. When God gives you that peace, you will rest in his security, his protection, his comfort, his love. We're going to be starting with verse 1 and we're going to continue down through chapter 22. And it reads, David went to town of Nob to see Ahimelech, the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. Why are you alone? He asked. Why is no one with you? The king has sent me on a private matter, David said. He told me not to tell anyone why I am here. I have told my men where to meet me later. Now, what is there to eat? Give me 5 loaves of bread and anything else you have. We don't have any regular bread, the priest replied, but there is a holy bread, which you can have if your young men have not slept with any women recently. Don't worry, David replied. I never allow my men to be with women when we are on a campaign. And since they stay clean even on ordinary trips, how much more on this one? Since there is no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of the presence that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. Now Dog the Adamite, Saul's chief herdsman, was there that day, having been detained before the Lord. David asked Ahimelech, do you have a spear or sword? The king's business was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab a weapon. I only have the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, the priest replied. It was wrapped in the cloths behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there is nothing else here. There is nothing like it, David replied. Give it to me. So David escaped from Saul and went to the king Achish of Gath. But the officer Achish were unhappy about his being there. Isn't this David, the king of the land? They asked. Isn't he the one the people honor with dances and singing? Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. David heard these comments and was very afraid of what King Achish of Gath might do to him. So he pretended to be insane, scratching on doors and drooling down his beard. Finally, King Achish said to his men, must you bring me a madman? We already have enough of them around here. Why should I let someone like this be my guest? Chapter 22. David at the cave of Adullam. So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and all his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt, who were just discontented, until David was the captain of about 400 men. Later, David went to Espah in Moab, where he asked the king, please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what God is going to do for me. So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold. One day, the prophet Gad told David, leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judea. So David went to the forest of Hereth. The news of his arrival in Judea soon reached Saul. At the time, the king was sitting beneath the tamarisk tree on the hill of Gibeah, holding his spear and surrounded by his soldiers. Listen here, you men of Benjamin, Saul shouted to his officers when he heard the news. Has that son of Jesse promised every one of you fields and vineyards? Has he promised to make you all generals and captains in his army? Is that why you have conspired against me? For not one of you told me when my own son made a solemn pact with the son of Jesse. You're not even sorry for me. Think of it. My own son encouraged him to kill me, as he is trying to do this very day. Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing there with Saul's men, spoke up. When I was in Nob, he said, I saw the son of Jesse talking to the priest, Ahimelech, son of Ahitub. Elimelech consulted the Lord for him. Then he gave him food, the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So that is God's holy word that I just read to you. Now let's break down these chapters to get some answers. So first we'll be looking at verses 1 to 9. David fled to the high priest Elimelech at Nob, seeking help of God's servant. What we see is the unexpected fear of Elimelech was suspicious of a breach between David and Saul. The lie, the deception of David, what did he say? Well, we see that he led tragic results. In chapter 22, verse 6 to 19, we'll also see he said he was on a secret mission for the king. He said his men were to meet him at another location. More deception. The request by David for food. He deceived and he was deceptive because he knew that Saul will find out where he was located and try to kill him. This was a man that was on the run. His request by David for food. David asked for 5 loaves of bread. However, the priest had no ordinary bread, only holy bread. David's men could have it if they obeyed the military purity. There was a military purity law for men to abstain from sex during battle. We see that in Exodus chapter 19 verse 15 and 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 6 to 13 as well. David assured the priests that his soldiers were holy. He personally required them to maintain an active and holy relationship with God. We see that. We also see the priest gave David the holy and consecrated bread, the bread of the presence. It had just been removed and replaced with hot bread. Now we go into the uneasy and tragic presence of Saul's servant, his chief shepherd, Doeg the Edomite. In chapter 22, verses 9 and all of chapter 22, we'll also see the request by David for a weapon. He stated that he had left without his sword because the king's mission was so urgent. The priests informed him that Goliath's sword, the very sword that David had earlier dedicated to the Lord, was still there and he could take it. What we'll also see now in verses 10 to 15, let's go down there. We'll see David fled to the Philistine king, Achish, deliverance from life-threatening fear. We'll see that. How? The threat to David by the official of Achish. What was that threat? They saw David as a defector, a mercenary, an enemy of Saul. They feared and were suspicious that he might turn against them too. The cautious fear of David and his strategy of escape. We see that in Psalms chapter 34. David pretended to be insane. He walked around drooling and salivating on his beard, abusing public property by writing graffiti on the doors and of city gates. Achish strongly objected to the madman being in his army and in his presence. Achish had David removed, driven from his presence. We see that in Psalms chapter 34 too. Also, David escaped to the cave to Adullam, a time of deep anguish, crying out to the Lord in prayer. We see that in David. We also see that in 1 and 2. And we can refer to Psalms chapter 142 to go deeper. How do we see this? Well, his family joined him. They feared Saul for his reprisal. A force of 400 men also joined him. Those that was in distress, in debt, or discontented. Men of broken fortune, relentless spirits. David sought to take care of his parents. The believer's clear duty is to take care of their parents. We see that chapter 22 verses 3 to 4. How do we see that? David moved to Espah and asked the king of Moab to grant sanctuary to his family, to his parents specifically. David's parents stayed in Moab as long as David was hiding out in a stronghold in the land of Moab. David was guided by the Lord through the prophet Gad. God's guidance through the trials of life. We see that in verses 5, which read, one day the prophet Gad told David, leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judea. So David went to the forest of Hereth. But what we see from that, he was to leave Mizpah, and he did return to Judea. So now we'll see in verses 6 to 10, we'll see the suspicious of Saul. So now we'll see in chapter 22 verses 6 to 10, the suspicion of Saul that a massive conspiracy against him existed. The terrible evil of hostility, anger, and wrath consumed King Saul. Saul heard of David's return to Judea with followers flocking to him, heard while conducting official business. Saul flew into a rage, half-crazed tirade, launching a barrage of insane accusations against his officials. How do we see that? Where do we see that? Well, we see he suggested that they would lose their wealth and leadership positions under David, suggested that they were conspiring against him. He even suggested that Jonathan was the ringleader of the conspiracy and that David was merely Jonathan's hired assassin. Saul was told immediately that David had fled to the high priest Elimelech for help and disclosed by Doeg the Edomite. He witnessed David's visit. He saw the priest pray for David and give him food and a sword. So now we'll end and we'll go over to the next verse, which is 11 to 19, and we'll take it all the way down to the end of this chapter. I hope that it was helpful. God bless you and God bless your family.